Did you know that when Detroit filed for bankruptcy in 2013, it was the largest city bankruptcy filing by debt ever, estimated at a massive $18 to $20 billion? Or that in the 1950s, Detroit was the richest city in the US and maybe even the world, according to some people? Based on this, it probably won't surprise you to learn that Detroit has faced a lot of challenges over the years, from the collapse of its automotive industry during the 2008 financial crisis to the city's own bankruptcy filings in 2013. However, despite these negative events, Detroit wasn't always a place of hardships, and in fact, during its early years, Detroit was one of America's most promising cities. What might be even more surprising is that recent events even suggest that things might be looking up for the city today. But what's the cause of all the ups and downs Detroit has faced over the years? Well, today on Across the Globe, we're going to be looking at how Detroit went from good to bad to good again. Part 1. Detroit's early years and initial rise. While Detroit was technically founded all the way back in 1701 due largely to its strategic location near the Great Lakes, it wasn't until the late 1800s that the city really started to take off. While due to multiple factors, this success was largely driven by an industrial boom with, for instance, the Eureka Iron Works factory being developed in 1864, which laid the groundwork for Detroit's future in manufacturing. During this time, the city's population grew from 45,619 in 1860 to 285,704 by 1900, reflecting its status as a prominent industrial hub. At the time, Detroit was viewed as an important city both nationally and globally, even earning the nickname the Little Paris of the Midwest due to its French roots, prominent architecture, and thriving cultural scene. But it was during the early 20th century that Detroit's success really took off and marked the beginning of Detroit's golden era, due largely to explosive growth in its automotive industry. As you probably know, Henry Ford established the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, whose Rouge River Industrial Complex quickly became the largest integrated factory in the world by 1932, with over 100,000 workers and 120 miles of conveyor belts in its massive factory. This was largely due to Ford's implementation of the assembly line, which significantly lowered the cost of production and, in turn, made automobiles accessible to the American middle class. In addition to Ford, Detroit was also home to two other major car manufacturers, Chrysler and General Motors, or GM. Together, these companies were known as the Big Three and were huge players in the US and global car markets. The success brought about by Detroit's automotive industry resulted in significant social and economic impacts for the city. Detroit became a symbol of the American dream, as it offered solid employment opportunities and a high standard of living. Meanwhile, its population quickly growing, Detroit started to make key advancements in public infrastructure and services. For instance, public schools, libraries, and healthcare facilities were constructed, along with numerous cultural attractions, like the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Detroit Public Library. By the year 1930, Detroit's population had soared to over 1.5 million, making it the fourth largest city in the United States. This population boom was driven not only by European immigrants looking for work opportunities in Detroit's factories, but also by Black migrants from the South seeking better economic opportunities during the Great Migration, which describes the movement of Black Americans from the South to the North, West, and Midwest between 1910 and 1970. By the time 1950 rolled around, Detroit had reached what many would consider its peak, as it was the wealthiest city in the country, having the highest GDP per capita. Despite Detroit's early success, however, its industrialization and demographic changes also brought challenges. The city's reliance on the automotive industry made it especially vulnerable to economic downturns like the Great Depression. Additionally, the influx of migrants and immigrants led to social tensions, particularly racial conflicts, that would become more pronounced in the latter part of the 20th century. Part 2. Detroit's downfall. Suburbanization and white flight. Following World War II, Detroit saw a significant shift in its demographics take place. Specifically, During this time, many of Detroit's white residents began moving to the suburbs, a phenomenon known as white flight. This exodus was fueled by several factors, including the availability of affordable automobiles, as we saw earlier, suburban development and a trend towards suburbanization, and the construction of interstate highways that better allowed for commuting from the suburbs to the city. However, also during this time, discriminatory practices like redlining, which denied mortgages to minority buyers in white neighborhoods, led to issues within the city of Detroit itself, in that it saw increasing segregation. As white families continued to leave the city, Detroit's tax base began to erode, leading to a decline in public services and further accelerating this outward migration. By the 1960s, the city's population had begun to decline, and the racial composition of Detroit was shifting rapidly. Tensions exploded in July 1967 when Detroit experienced one of the largest urban riots of that time, further accelerating the city's decline. Sparked by a police raid on an unlicensed bar, the riot quickly turned into a full-blown uprising against systemic racism and police brutality. Over the course of 5 days, Detroit witnessed huge amounts of violence and destruction, with 43 people killed, almost 1,200 injured, and over 7,200 arrested. The rioting also resulted in large amounts of property damage, including nearly 1,400 buildings burned or destroyed. Combined with the white flight that was already happening at the time and Detroit's history of discrimination against minorities, the race riots further led to Detroit's image of a city in decline. Deindustrialization and economic decline. In addition to Detroit's social issues, the city soon started facing economic issues as well. While, as we saw earlier, the city's rapid growth was founded upon industrialization, things took a turn for the worse when the process of deindustrialization began in the 1960s. This period marked the beginning of a long, gradual decline for Detroit, as it completely changed the city's economy and eventually contributed to its bankruptcy. Deindustrialization started happening as the world became increasingly globalized. As a result, the big three car manufacturers started facing significant competition from abroad, especially from Japan and Europe, who were able to produce cars more cheaply due to lower labor costs and more efficient production methods. In response, American automakers, including the Big Three, began shifting their production facilities abroad and to other regions within the United States where it was more affordable to manufacture. The impact of these shifts on Detroit was huge. The city's manufacturing, which had been the foundation of its economy for decades, began to crumble. As factories closed or moved away, unemployment rates soared and crime began to rise. As the manufacturing jobs that had once provided a stable middle class for many of Detroit's residents disappeared, the city's tax base eroded even further. This financial strain made it increasingly difficult for the city to maintain its public services and infrastructure. And despite efforts to diversify its economy, by the end of the 20th century, Detroit was grappling with some pretty serious problems. 2008 financial crisis. While Detroit was in a troubled spot by the end of the 20th century, things didn't get better for it when the early 2000s rolled around. In fact, things got much worse, particularly for the automotive industry. There were several key factors that led to trouble for the Big Three. First, the automotive industry was hit hard by the 2003 to 2008 oil crisis, which led to a significant increase in fuel prices. This, in turn, made the relatively fuel-inefficient car models produced by the Big Three less attractive to consumers, who were increasingly turning to more fuel-efficient vehicles offered by foreign producers. The situation was made even worse by the 2008 financial crisis, as this led to a big decline in consumer spending and tightened credit markets, making it difficult for consumers to finance new cars. As a result, the Big Three soon found themselves with an even greater decline in sales. By the time late 2008 rolled around, the Big Three's financial situations were in pretty bad shape. Chrysler and General Motors were facing bankruptcy, which would eventually lead to massive job losses. In response to these manufacturers' impending bankruptcies, the U.S. government intervened with a bailout plan. Ultimately, though, Chrysler and General Motors could not avoid bankruptcy altogether. Chrysler filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in May of 2009, followed by General Motors a month later. As you can imagine, the bankruptcy of Chrysler and General Motors had a hugely negative impact on Detroit, making things much worse for a city that was already struggling with decades of industrial decline and population loss. The automotive industry had long been the backbone of Detroit's economy, and the bankruptcies led to significant job losses not only directly within Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors, but also across the automotive industry's network of suppliers and associated businesses. The unemployment rate in Detroit surged during this time, and Detroit's tax base eroded even further as people lost their jobs and homes. Over the course of the next few years, Detroit's population dropped dramatically, seeing a 25% decline between 2000 and 2011, which totaled a loss of over 713,000 residents. As we'll see shortly, this ended up causing even more problems for the city, as in order to be financially stable, the city of Detroit relied on a tax base of about 750,000 people at a minimum. Detroit's bankruptcy in 2013. If you think the bankruptcy of Detroit's largest car manufacturer sounds bad, things unfortunately still got worse for the city. Confronted with years of a declining population and tax revenues alongside the auto industry's collapse, Detroit found itself unable to cope any longer. In 2013, the city of Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy, which was the largest city bankruptcy filing in U.S. history by the amount of debt. Ultimately, this filing showed that the city was unable to meet its financial obligations and marked a new low point in Detroit's history. As you can imagine, the residents of Detroit were significantly affected by both the auto industry's collapse and Detroit's bankruptcy filings. Communities were disrupted by job losses and house foreclosures, with even schools facing budget cuts and closures. To make matters worse, Detroit's status as a city in decline made it harder than ever to attract new investments, businesses, and residents. Crime. As Detroit saw its financial troubles continue to mount, its levels of crime started to rise as well, and Detroit would soon be known as one of the most dangerous and crime-filled cities in the U.S. In the 1980s, Detroit frequently had some of the highest homicide rates in the nation. This was made worse by huge amounts of corruption in its police department, further contributing to issues with crime. While crime decreased after its peak in the 1980s, it still remained a major issue for the city. For example, in 2006, the violent crime rate in Detroit was at a whopping 2,419 incidents per 100,000 people, compared to 564 per 100,000 elsewhere in Michigan, and 479 per 100,000 in the rest of the U.S. While that rate dropped slightly in subsequent years, it still has remained over 4.5 times the national average crime rate, and as you can imagine, this has further led to Detroit's decline as a city. Part 3. Detroit's comeback. So where does Detroit stand today? Well, after decades of economic decline, Detroit is surprisingly showing signs of experiencing a revival, as seen in the city's decreasing crime and violence, new developments, amenities, and young professionals seeking opportunities there. One of the most visible signs of Detroit's comeback is the transformation of its downtown area. Once a ghost town after business hours, present-day downtown Detroit is seeing far more signs of life. For instance, the opening of Little Caesars Arena in 2017, home to the Detroit Red Wings and the Detroit Pistons, kick-started development in the area. Additionally, the District Detroit, a massive 50-block development, has brought new residential, retail, and entertainment options to the heart of the city. In addition to its downtown area, neighborhoods like Midtown and Corktown have also seen revitalization. Midtown, where large institutions like Wayne State University and the Detroit Medical Center are located, has become a new hotspot for young professionals and entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, Corktown, which is one of Detroit's oldest surviving neighborhoods, has transformed into a hub of activity following the opening of new restaurants, breweries, and residential developments. The city's comeback has also been fueled by a growing startup and entrepreneurial ecosystem. Organizations like TechTown and the Detroit Entrepreneurship Network have provided resources and support for entrepreneurs, helping to foster a thriving startup community. So much so that Detroit was recently named a top emerging startup ecosystem. Detroit's resurgence has also caught the attention of major corporations and organizations. In 2022, for instance, Forbes chose to host its prestigious 30 Under 30 Summit in Detroit, recognizing the city's potential and attractiveness to young entrepreneurs. Another positive for Detroit is that its levels of crime have decreased in recent years. In 2023, for instance, Detroit saw the lowest homicide levels in 57 years, along with significant declines in shootings and carjackings. Specifically, the number of homicides dropped 18.4% between 2022 and 2023, the number of non-fatal shootings 15.8%, and the number of carjackings 33.5%. This decline in crime has been attributed to a number of factors, including a huge collaboration effort among federal, state, and local government and community agencies. While challenges remain, including the need to address the city's high poverty rates, improve education, and eliminate racial and ethnic disparities, Detroit does show promising signs of making a comeback. As more people and businesses are drawn to Detroit's community, the city's future looks brighter than it has in decades. What about what happened to Oakland, California?